It was late, just past 11:30 p.m., and the road stretched ahead like a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the quiet night. The streetlights buzzed faintly, their pale light casting long shadows over the deserted highway outside the small town of Milford, Ohio. Only a few cars passed, their headlights briefly illuminating the wet pavement before they disappeared into the night. The air was crisp, the kind of cool that came with the early hours when the world seemed to slow down and everyone just wanted to get home. But not him. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Harris had been on the road for over 2 hours, feeling the weight of his day finally start to catch up with him. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the steering wheel, his mind preoccupied with thoughts of the case he had been handling earlier that day. But the monotonous drive offered some reprieve, and he let his eyes wander to the darkened sky, humming along to the soft rhythm of an old jazz track that played through his car's speakers. He wasn't wearing his uniform, just a simple gray sweatshirt and jeans, but it didn't matter. Harris had been in the military long enough to carry himself with a certain confidence, a quiet authority that made him stand out even in casual clothing. He had earned that confidence through years of hard work, late nights, and difficult decisions. The world was his to command, and that badge, the one that hung from his rearview mirror, was a symbol of his power. At least, that's what he thought. The hum of his thoughts was broken by the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. They were closing in fast, their bright glow making the night feel suddenly much more intense. Harris sighed, not out of fear, but out of frustration. Another interruption in his evening. He had been driving carefully, had nothing to worry about, yet here it was, another unnecessary stop. He wasn't surprised, just annoyed. He signaled and pulled his car to the shoulder, the engine purring as he brought it to a complete stop. He let out a long breath and kept both hands on the wheel. It was a familiar routine. He knew what to do. Hands visible, no sudden moves. He had dealt with traffic stops before, though most of them had been uneventful. A white patrol car stopped behind him, its engine idling low, and the officer stepped out with deliberate slowness. His movement spoke of a man who expected respect, perhaps even fear. His boots thudded against the ground as he approached, one hand resting on his belt, the other gripping a flashlight that bounced slightly with each step. Harris didn't turn to look at him right away, but he could feel the officer's gaze piercing through the rearview mirror. The name on his badge, Reynolds, gleamed in the light. License and registration, the officer said, his tone flat, almost mechanical. No greeting, no pleasantries. Harris met the officer's eyes in the mirror, calm, steady. He could feel the officer's expectation that he would immediately comply, but there was no reason to rush. He reached into the glove compartment and slowly pulled out his documents. "Was I speeding, officer?" he asked, his voice even, neutral. His hands moved deliberately to ensure there was no misunderstanding. Reynolds didn't answer right away. He took the papers from Harris's hands, holding them just out of reach as he glanced at the car, inspecting it as though looking for a reason to escalate the situation. After a moment, he spoke again. "Tail lights are out." Harris furrowed his brow. "That can't be right," he said. His taillights had been checked recently, but Reynolds wasn't interested in hearing that. "Are you arguing with me?" Reynolds' voice grew sharper, colder. Harris paused, his eyes still focused ahead. He could feel the air around them shifting, growing thicker with tension. He had seen this before, many times. Officers who wore their badges like shields, who saw their uniform as a license to demand unquestioning compliance. But Harris knew better. He had earned his rank with dignity and respect, not fear, and he wasn't about to let anyone strip that from him. "I'm not arguing," he replied calmly. "I'm just saying that the tail lights were checked. I can get it fixed if there's an issue, but it's fine." Reynolds didn't even let him finish. He snapped. Harris didn't hesitate. He unbuckled his seatbelt and reached for the door handle. "Mind telling me why?" he asked, his voice still steady, but with a tinge of curiosity. Reynolds didn't answer. His expression was unreadable. "Because I said so," he said with a smirk. The words hung in the air for a moment, and Harris felt a flicker of annoyance, but he didn't let it show. He opened the door and stepped out, the cool night air biting at his skin. He could feel Reynolds' eyes on him as he stepped onto the pavement. Sizing him up, Harris remained relaxed, but every muscle in his body was alert. "Turn around, Shell." "Hands on the car," Reynolds ordered, his voice taking on a new edge, one that Harris recognized immediately. It was the voice of a man who was used to being obeyed without question. For a moment, Harris didn't move. For what reason? He asked, his voice calm, but sharp with curiosity. Reynolds took a step closer. Are you resisting? He demanded. Harris's eyes narrowed. No, I'm asking a question. Reynolds's jaw tightened. He didn't like the defiance. Harris could see that much. Without warning, Reynolds grabbed his radio and spoke into it. We've got a non-compliant driver here, he muttered. Harris remained unmoved, his stance firm. He wasn't about to give in to intimidation. I need you to understand something, Harris said quietly, his voice calm but firm. I know exactly what I'm allowed to do, and I know exactly what you can't do. Reynolds's face darkened, his jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed, but Harris stood his ground, unshaken, under arrest. Reynolds barked, his hand darting toward Harris's wrist. For a brief moment, Harris hesitated. The situation could escalate quickly, but he wasn't about to be dragged into something without a reason. He moved just enough to avoid Reynolds' grasp, his military training kicking in. Under arrest for what? He asked, his voice steady but cutting through the tension. Reynolds didn't answer. He pulled out his cuffs, and within moments, Harris felt the cold metal clamping around his wrists. Too tight, a sharp breath escaped his lips, but he didn't flinch. He kept his composure. You don't know what you're doing, Harris muttered, his voice low, but with a clear warning. Reynolds chuckled, as if this were a game. Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing. Harris didn't respond. His mind was already calculating the next steps. His military background had prepared him for moments like these. Moments when power was abused, when the system was bent to serve the self-righteous. He had been through worse. This was just another challenge. But he knew one thing. Reynolds had just made a fatal mistake. As the patrol car rumbled down the empty road, the overhead lights flashing red and blue, Harris sat in the back seat, his thoughts racing. The cuffs dug painfully into his wrists, and the cold plastic of the car's seat seemed to grow more uncomfortable with every passing second. His mind was clear. This was a test of patience, a waiting game. He had been in tight situations before, but this felt different. The arrogance of Officer Reynolds, the smug confidence with which he had dragged Harris out of his car, irritated him more than he cared to admit. But the fight wasn't over yet. Reynolds sat in the front seat, his attention half on the road and half on the rearview mirror, checking on Harris with an occasional glance. The silence between them was thick, filled with the tension of a confrontation that neither had fully anticipated. Harris, however, remained calm, controlled, even as the pain from the cuffs began to flare up. His breathing was slow, steady, just like the drills he had learned to rely on during his time in the military. Most people just shut up when I tell them to get out, Reynolds said after a while, his voice tinged with arrogance. They don't argue. They don't question me. Harris exhaled sharply, not out of frustration, but as a way to keep his focus sharp. Most officers don't arrest people for questioning a traffic stop either, he said, his voice calm but firm. Reynolds laughed, a short, dismissive sound. You must really think you're somebody, he muttered, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips. Harris didn't answer, keeping his gaze fixed on the back of Reynolds' head. The officer's words, meant to provoke him, fell flat. He had heard it all before. Officers who saw themselves as above the law, who wielded their badge like a weapon. This wasn't the first time Harris had been targeted by someone like Reynolds, and it wouldn't be the last. But what made this situation different was the reality that Reynolds had made a grave mistake by picking a fight with the wrong person. I'm not the one in the wrong here, Harris muttered under his breath, mostly to himself, but I'll make sure everyone knows who the real criminal is. The patrol car crept toward the station, the familiar sight of the gray, squat brick building coming into view. The parking lot was mostly empty, except for a few cars parked in the dark. The dim lights illuminated the surroundings, casting an eerie glow on the cracked pavement. Harris's pulse quickened slightly, but his face remained neutral. He wasn't worried, not yet. Reynolds pulled the car into a reserved parking spot and shut off the engine. He didn't say anything as he stepped out of the car, slamming the door behind him. Harris could hear the faint click of his boots on the ground, a rhythm that sounded almost too confident, too sure of itself. But Harris wasn't intimidated. The door swung open, and Reynolds yanked him out of the car. Let's go, he ordered, his voice cold and authoritative. He grabbed Harris's wrist, the grip tighter than necessary, and yanked him toward the building. Inside, the stale smell of old coffee and sweat filled the air. The officers behind the desk barely acknowledged their arrival, too engrossed in their own tasks to care about Harris's presence. It was as if he were just another person being processed through the system, just another case file waiting to be filled out. But Harris knew better. This wasn't just any arrest, and Reynolds wasn't just any officer. He had made a mistake, and Harris was going to make sure everyone knew about it. The booking process was swift, almost mechanical. Reynolds uncuffed Harris long enough to push him through the routine. Fingerprints, mugshot, the usual procedure. Harris didn't flinch, didn't let the indignity of the situation show on his face. He had been through worse. He had been in situations where his life had been on the line, where he had to fight for every inch of ground. This was just a moment in time, a setback, but not a defeat. Reynolds' words echoed in Harris's mind as he was pushed into a holding cell. "You think you're smart, huh?" the officer had muttered, his grip tightening around Harris's wrist. Harris glanced sideways at the metal bars, his breath slow and controlled. He didn't answer. There was no need. His silence spoke volumes. He wasn't in a rush to explain himself. He wasn't here to beg for mercy. He was here to make a point. The cell was small, but Harris had been in worse. The hard, cold bench felt like nothing compared to the dangers he had faced in combat zones, or the high-stakes operations he had been part of. This was a minor inconvenience. It was uncomfortable, sure, but it was nothing more than a temporary setback. And he had a plan. Outside the cell, the officers went about their business, indifferent to Harris's presence. The occasional shuffle of paperwork, the clinking of coffee cups against desks, it was all a reminder of the indifference that had allowed men like Reynolds to operate unchecked. But that was about to change. Harris knew that once word got out, things would start to move. He had friends in high places, connections that extended beyond the walls of this station. He wasn't just some faceless civilian caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was someone who mattered, someone who had earned his place in the world. And Reynolds, he was just another officer who thought he could get away with bending the rules. As Harris sat there, his mind wandered back to the moment he had first crossed paths with Reynolds. The officer had thought he was untouchable, a man above the law. But what Reynolds didn't realize was that power wasn't just about badges and uniforms. It was about who you knew, who you could call when things went wrong. And Harris had the right people on his side. The minutes ticked by, the weight of the situation hanging over him like a cloud. But Harris wasn't worried. He had a plan, and soon it would unfold. Then, as expected, Reynolds returned. His face was no longer smug. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, an uncertainty that had not been there before. He stood in front of Harris's cell, arms crossed, that familiar smirk gone. "You think you're special," he muttered, stepping closer to the bars. Harris didn't answer, keeping his gaze steady and unflinching. He wasn't about to engage with Reynolds. The officer was just trying to get a rise out of him, to prove some twisted point. But Harris had learned long ago that silence was often the most powerful response. "You know, you're not the first person to think they're above the law," Reynolds said, his tone softer now, almost calculating. "But most people know when to back down." "I don't back down," Harris replied, his voice quiet but firm. "And neither should anyone else." Reynolds seemed to take a step back, his eyes narrowing, as if he were trying to decipher Harris's words. The silence stretched on, but Harris knew it wouldn't last long. The wheels were already in motion. Word had already spread. And Reynolds, he had no idea what was coming next. Morning light filtered through the narrow windows of the courthouse, casting long streaks of pale yellow on the polished floors. The air inside was crisp, the kind of cold that seemed to settle deep into your bones the longer you stayed still. Harris stood near the defendant's table, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. No longer in handcuffs or an orange jumpsuit, he was wearing a well-tailored navy blue blazer and a simple white blouse underneath. The calmness in his demeanor was like a force field, keeping him composed even in this moment of uncertainty. His attorney, Lisa Barrett, stood beside him, flipping through a stack of papers, her movements swift and methodical. Lisa was efficient, focused on the task at hand, no wasted words, no unnecessary talk. Harris appreciated that. In this situation, it was exactly what he needed. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and Harris saw Reynolds enter, his posture still stiff, shoulders squared, as though he still believed he could control the room. His chin was slightly lifted, and his eyes scanned the room with that familiar arrogance. But something had changed. His steps were slower now, more deliberate. He wasn't as confident as he had been the night before. The self-assurance that had filled him when he placed Harris in that holding cell was gone, replaced by a sense of unease that Harris could detect from the moment their eyes met. For once, Reynolds wasn't in control. Harris felt a flicker of satisfaction at the realization. As Reynolds passed by, their eyes met. Harris's gaze was steady, unwavering. Reynolds, however, quickly looked away. His face momentarily flushed. Good. Let him squirm. Harris didn't need to say anything. The silent exchange was enough. Judge Alan Kirkland, an older man with graying hair and a weary expression, entered the room. He adjusted his glasses and settled into the seat, the sharp sound of his gavel striking the desk, commanding the room to quiet. All right, the judge said, glancing over the case files. Let's get to it. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair and a well-groomed mustache, cleared his throat and began, Your Honor, we have reason to believe that the defendant, Lieutenant Commander Samuel Harris, was unlawfully detained without probable cause. Furthermore, new information suggests a pattern of misconduct involving the arresting officer, Sergeant Scott Reynolds. A murmur rippled through the room as the words landed, and Harris could feel the tension in the air. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening. The prosecutor continued, flipping through a stack of documents with precision. Lieutenant Commander Harris has an impeccable record, the prosecutor said. A distinguished career in the military, a graduate of the Naval Academy, and multiple commendations. No criminal history, no outstanding citations. Are you telling me that despite all of this, she was such a threat that she had to be arrested over a broken taillight? Reynolds opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension, until the prosecutor continued, unfazed. Additionally, he said, holding up a file, an internal review of Sergeant Reynolds' arrest history shows a disproportionate number of traffic stops involving black drivers in this district. The room buzzed with whispers, and Harris could feel the weight of the accusations pressing in. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been wronged, for everyone who had been subjected to this kind of injustice. It was about more than just her rights. It was about accountability. Reynolds' face had gone pale. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, but the defensive posture couldn't shield him from the scrutiny of the court. The judge peered at him over his glasses, his expression disapproving. Sergeant Reynolds, Judge Kirkland said, his voice laced with disappointment. Care to explain yourself? Reynolds leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. But the words didn't come. He was struggling now. His authority, his power, was slipping away, and he knew it. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. Unofficial body cam footage tells a different story. It shows Lieutenant Commander Harris, calm and compliant. You boo-boo-boo. Sergeant Reynolds were the one who escalated the situation. Reynolds' face twisted, but he couldn't deny it. The footage spoke for itself. A moment passed, and then the judge finally spoke, his voice heavy with finality. Sergeant Reynolds, Judge Kirkland said, slamming his gavel down, you broke protocol, made an unlawful arrest, and left out key details in your report. Charges against Lieutenant Commander Harris are dismissed, effective immediately, and I recommend an internal investigation into your conduct. The courtroom was still for a moment before the murmur of approval spread, but Harris didn't let it show on her face. This was just the beginning. She had won this battle, but there were more battles ahead. Reynolds stood frozen, his face darkening, his world unraveling in real time. Harris, however, stood tall, unwavering. She turned to walk out of the courtroom without saying a word. The moment she stepped out into the hallway, she heard the heavy footsteps of someone approaching. It was Chief Thomas Mitchell, his expression stern. Follow me, he said, his tone sharp and demanding. Reynolds followed him into an office nearby. Harris could hear their voices rising in the hallway, but she couldn't make out the words. She didn't need to. It was clear that Reynolds was about to face consequences for his actions. Inside the office, Mitchell was grilling Reynolds, his voice a low growl. What the hell were you thinking? Mitchell demanded. This wasn't just any civilian you arrested. You took down a Navy officer without cause. Internal Affairs is on this. Reynolds, you're suspended, effective immediately. And if the review confirms what we're seeing here, your career is over. Outside, Harris stood with her back straight, her mind already moving on to the next steps. The press would get word soon. The case had already gone viral. She had made sure of that. As she walked through the streets of Milford, the weight of the world seemed to lift from her shoulders. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow on the city, and she felt the calmness that had been absent for so long. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from her captain. You've seen the news. The message read, How are you feeling? Harris smiled to herself. Like I did what I was supposed to do, she typed back, her fingers moving swiftly over the screen. You've made your mark, the captain replied. Department of Defense wants to hear your thoughts on this. Might even ask you to speak about it. Harris's smile faded slightly, and she thought about the attention she was about to receive. I'm not sure I want to be a headline, she responded. You already are, the captain replied. And you've earned that right. The recognition, the accolades. It was all secondary. Harris wasn't doing this for fame or for praise. She was doing it for the people who didn't have a voice, for those who couldn't fight back. It wasn't just about her. It was about creating a world where this kind of abuse didn't happen anymore. She walked on, steady in her purpose, a quiet confidence radiating from her. She was no longer just a victim. She was a force for change. Across the street, she saw a mother walking with her young son, his hand held tightly in hers. They were laughing, carefree, a beautiful picture of the world as it should be. Innocent, free from fear. Harris watched them for a moment, and the fight she had been fighting made sense. This was why she kept pushing, kept speaking out, not for herself, but for every child who deserved to grow up in a world without fear, a world where justice, no matter how difficult, prevailed. As she took a deep breath, she knew that this fight was far from over. But today, she had won, and tomorrow, she would keep fighting. Because real change only happens when we hold the system accountable. And Harris was just getting started.